Before tombs were museums and augury was trivia, the ancient Etruscans navigated their hilly world with a tapestry of secrets that would puzzle today's rational minds. It was called Haruspex harmony, a daily rhythm woven with portents and incantations, split as neatly as the Tiber's banks during flood season. The routine was straightforward. Upon waking, most Etruscans whispered prayers to the deities, invoking protection against the unseen forces that lurked in sacred groves. Then, throughout the day, they'd pause for what can only be described as divinatory safeguards. This wasn't seen as paranoia, it was just how life flowed. The watchful hours between tasks were viewed as essential, practical, and sometimes delightfully communal. People used this time to consult livers, sprinkle protective spelt, or check their bucero vases, because nothing disrupts your day like wondering if a thunder spirit is eyeing your vineyard. And yes, this was also prime time for clan rituals. Etruscan leucomones and household seers noted that the mind was clear and attuned during these moments, which sounds like a subtle way of saying too relaxed to question the gods. So, if you ever thought you were thoughtful for avoiding lightning strikes, just know your ancestors were setting the bar with bronze mirrors and sacred falcons. The evening would follow this interlude, winding down until starlight. Everyone from kings to farmers embraced this mystical cadence. Even epic tales like those in the Liber Linteus casually referenced it, which means that, yes, even in ancient linen books, people were noting the importance of warding off netherworld echoes. Curiously, modern anthropology suggests these enigmas might align with natural human instincts for pattern seeking. The ritual cycle matches how our brains process uncertainty without modern science. So, the next time you read the signs at midnight, don't fret, just murmur, "Ah, yes, the ward has begun," and go polish a symbolic fulgur. It wasn't until later eras with Roman conquests, imperial lamps, and the rise of skepticism that humans began to enforce the idea of logic over lore, as though beliefs were a timed debate. In the ancient Tuscan world, encountering a portent midday wasn't a flaw, it was the norm, and everyone followed it, whether they understood it or not. Let's talk about dwellings, or rather the Etruscan version of them. In our era, we fuss over smart homes, ergonomic furniture, and ambient lighting. In ancient Veii and Tarquinia, a home was often a Tufa-Block hut of wood and clay, stuffed with charms that once warded off lar spirits, now faded under the soils of time and unspoken fears. The typical peasant abode featured reed mats known as sleeping platforms. This was literally rushes or straw bundled into a low frame if they had the means for one. If not, it was just mats on the floor, possibly damp, possibly shared with a sacred animal. These platforms weren't luxurious, but they beat the alternative of wolf-infested hills. Reeds were abundant, insulating, and good at absorbing Apennine moisture. They were also prime spots for hiding protective figurines, sardonyx gems, and the occasional wandering beetle, which turned resting into a lesson in cautious repose. If it rustled, you ignored it. If it pinched, you shifted gently and hoped for divine favor. If a family had more resources, or at least a sturdy roof, they might elevate the mat onto a stone base. This didn't transform the experience much, but it did lower the odds of waking to a viper in your sandal slightly. Woolens were a common comfort. Most slept in light tunics worn all day. Nightgowns weren't invented, and neither was solitude. Entire families, kids, parents, perhaps an elder, all slumbered together in the same room, sometimes on the same mat pile. If you overheated, you could always nudge into your sibling space. Nobles, naturally, had grander setups, elaborate beds with headrests, woven blankets, and canopies to block drafts, and hopefully evil eyes. These beds were so prized they were buried with owners.
You didn't inherit gold, you inherited Aunt Uni's curiously carved wooden rest. Still, for most Etruscans, a home wasn't for ease. It was a fortress against the underworld, to evade floods, and maybe, just maybe, to envision being exalted enough to sleep without whispering wards against the god of thunder. When we say lucky charm today, we think of a cereal or a four-leaf clover keychain, maybe something whimsical with a grin and a questionable backstory. But in ancient Etruria, a charm wasn't trivial. It was an amulet, a tangible, often elaborate piece of bronze or amber meant to shield your soul from dissolution in the afterlife while you navigated daily perils. You see, protection wasn't the forte of Etruscan architecture. Tufa walls, thatched roofs, and doorways of hide didn't stand much against tempests. And divine favor, that was a falcon. So, to guard their essence, especially since spirits escaped quickest through dreams, Etruscans embraced the humble amulet. These charms varied in forms and sizes, but the iconic apotropic eye was orb-shaped, symbolizing vigilance like the god Tinya. They were typically crafted from amber, gold, or whatever shard of magic could be spared without offending the earth gods. For men, it was a vital tool. For women, it often doubled as jewelry, which also served to uphold modesty and conceal hair that hadn't seen a ritual bath since the last Ludi festival. But beyond safeguarding, amulets carried cultural heft. In some cities, the Fulman ward was expected on everyone at all times, yes, even in repose, and the piece could be inscribed or colored to show a lineage's status or piety, because nothing declares prosperity like retiring with a mini deity on your chest. In urban hubs, the amulet even signified being at ease. If you greeted someone wearing one visibly, it was a polite Etruscan nod of, "I'm protected from the Lares." And yes, this bauble implies peace. Of course, amulets were paired with tibenes, essentially loose garments. Picture an Etruscan Haruspex minus the dramatic quest. Attire wasn't ornate, but it was functional, woolen, and occasionally blessed. Today, sharing a meal with strangers is mostly for conferences, awkward dates, or that rare hostel mishap. But in ancient Etruria, this was utterly routine and far from elective. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose chariot stalled halfway to Volci.
You seek a domus, a modest tufa structure at best, and request lodging. What you receive isn't privacy or cot, or even a swept floor. What you get is a spot on a mat already occupied. Etruscan compounds functioned like communal havens rather than solitary retreats. Seclusion wasn't anticipated. If the mat had room, you shared it, often with utter unknowns who might whisper dreams, invoke gods, or harbor mysterious mirrors. This wasn't impolite, it was resourceful. Mats could accommodate 2, 3, even 4 wayfarers based on size and tolerance. In larger oppida, you might land in a banquet-like space with rows of mats and 0 boundaries. Invocation contests went unspoken. Elbow claims were subtly negotiated. Sometimes genders separated, but not invariably. Some domus grouped by trade, potters with potters, priests with priests, merchants with fellow hagglers, allegedly. But frequently it was first arrived, first sprawled. And while this might horrify modern isolationists, then it trumped sleeping under stars with boars, floods, or occasional Celt raids. Concerned about theft, many travelers slept with pouches tied to belts or hidden in folds. Others rested atop bundles, making luggage both cushion and sentinel. If someone shifted your sack, it often meant awakening lighter. The elite, of course, avoided this. Lucomones journeyed with attendants and camped luxuriously, or demanded sole spaces if the host valued their favor. In the Etruscan realm, retiring wasn't merely drawing a curtain and fading, it was a divine endeavor, a nightly wager where the prize was your eternal anima.
People didn't just rest, they readied for potential judgment. Hence the ubiquity of evening invocations. Forget aromatherapy or soothing apps. Etruscan sleepers unwound with offerings, chants, and soul-purifying hymns, just in case they crossed to Ita's realm between dusk and dawn. The notion was plain. You could depart at any instant from ailment, curse, deities, or most perilously, being past 30 in the Iron Age. So you'd better intone your rites, not for solace, but because the underworld was daunting and you didn't want to arrive unprepared, unanointed, and spiritually unkempt. One prevalent verse, "If I should pass before dawn, I beseech Tenia my soul to claim." Charming, yes, except it's essentially a child's plea acknowledging demise as a likely nocturnal event. Many adults possessed a repertoire of chants for varied threats, one for guilt, one for suspecting the Vanth in the shadows, one for plague aversion, which sadly proved ineffective. Some even beseeched specific deities famed for guarding dreamers, like celestial wardens at the soul's gate. The truly pious Ziloth, Rosna, and anxious nobles concluded days with Vespers, the final rite before silence. After Vespers they observed quietude, which wasn't challenging, as all were fatigued, undernourished, and mildly wary of night. Children, too, were urged to chant, partly for their essence, partly to occupy them beyond querying why the falcon was on their mat again. Parents noted that gods watched, which seems endearing until realizing it's less protector and more divine oversight. In essence, pre-sleep rites were less about tranquility and more about 11th hour safeguarding. View it as ancient warding spells. You trusted they functioned even if the mechanics eluded you. In contemporary times, visions are often brushed off as subconscious gibberish, anxiety, excess spelt beer, or your mind sorting chaos in obscurity. But in ancient Etruria, dreams were regarded gravely, as in cosmic implications grave. Dreams weren't mere dreams. They were deemed missives from gods, ancestors, the netherworld, your Lhasa, or possibly that odd mirror you touched last symposium. Some were prophetic revelations, others infernal lures. Regardless, you were expected to heed and perhaps record or confess or purify for days to be secure. Haruspex, scribes, and self-styled seers devoted surprising time to deciphering dreams. Whole bronze tablets were devoted to interpretations. Dreamed of fire, might be chaos, water, renewal, or inundation. Dreamed of a falcon-headed charioteer, summon a temple expert promptly and perhaps relocate. Etruscans held that what transpired in dreams counted because your soul roamed while you slumbered. This implied dream deeds could expose concealed transgressions or spiritual flaws. That awkward dream about pilfering spelt, perhaps your inner self admitting worldly greed or just famine. But confess anyway, to err safe. Temple folk often noted dreams and shared with superiors. Some were lauded for sacred visions in sleep. Others advised to avoid olives pre-bed. Naturally, dreams weren't solely mystical enigmas. They fueled narratives too.
Etruscan lore brims with dream sequences where heroes meet deities, demons, or allegorical beasts reciting wisdom. Dreams were essentially the inscribed epic, but with more symbolism and fewer resolutions. The temples, predictably, were cautious. Not all dreams were holy, and some were thoughts sown by chaos gods to corrupt the pure. If you envisioned something impure, it might mean your essence was besieged or you dozed too near incense fumes again. In today's world, some let pets in bed. It's snug, if sometimes odorous. In ancient Etruria, sharing with animals wasn't quirky, it was a spiritual tactic. Let's begin with fundamentals. Etruscan homes weren't comfort-built. Tufa and clay, no seals, drafts fierce as Tyrrhenian winds. Sacred warmth, that was the family hound. In humble huts, humans and beasts often cohabited the same space, sometimes the same mat, and frequently the same reed bundle. Geese roamed, dogs nestled at feet, falcons perched by the hearth, and if fortunate, none scratched during night. This wasn't affection, though Etruscans revered animals. It was harmony. Beasts embodied gods, falcons vanth, dogs the underworld guides. They were divine, reliable, and unlike kin, didn't claim the best spot. A hound could ward spirits. A boar in the corner might elevate sanctity by a notch, which in storm season felt miraculous. Etruscan homes, especially modest ones, often had one room for all: cooking, dining, resting, occasionally rites. Kids might nestle between parents at a sacred falcon. A goose could alarm at dawn. Hygiene? Best not probe. For affluent families, this lessened. Nobles didn't typically slumber near livestock, though they might have favored hounds abed. Not for divinity, but for prestige and pest control. Some temples had separate quarters for holy animals, because nothing says authority like a falcon with its own perch and title. Drawbacks existed, of course. Beasts can be noisy, they wander, and historically they're not famed for boundaries. But Etruscans adapted. A beak poke at midnight? Just bedtime norm. If you've shared a banquet hall and thought, this is excessive, meet the ancient Etruscan temple dormitory, where ease went to meditate under vows of eternity. Temples shunned personal space, or luxury, or frivolity really. The standard dormitory housed dozens of haruspices in one vast chamber, arranged neatly like devout sentinels. Beds, if termed so, were stone slabs, sometimes with reed mats if the high priest felt benevolent or it was a holy day. You slept robed, not for decorum, but because dressing in dark for dawn rites was more arduous than bedding prepared. The priestly garb, including toga, sash, and sandals, served as spiritual shield and meager warmth. If chilled, you layered. If warm, well, no, you endured. No cushions, no dividers, and no chatter. Silence was mandated, not optional, under Tinia's rule. If you shifted and sighed too audibly, you might draw purification duty for a week. Crying falcons, however, were tolerated. You couldn't control them, but if disruptive, the gods might note, or at least your brethren would. Illumination was sparse, one lamp perhaps. You didn't need sight, you needed stillness and purity. That was the aim. Despite austerity, haruspices believed sparse beds prepared for eternity. Denying flesh honed the soul. Rest wasn't delight, it was duty, scheduled like offerings. Some haruspices even slumbered upright to shun indulgence or visions or ease. Compared to this, peasant reed piles and crying falcons seem opulent. At least the falcon didn't judge. Let's discuss something that would appall modern resters. Rising willingly at midnight, not for relief or scroll, but for ritual. Chanting, chilled, torchlit ritual. In Etruscan temples, this was standard. Haruspices followed strict schedules based on stellar hours, including dawn service, and by dawn we mean deepest night, when even stars pondered awakening. The lituus would sound, often struck by the unlucky, and the chamber of robed, rest-deprived souls would file to the altar in hush, and yes, still garbed, because haruspices shunned nightwear. The only system they trusted was divine. In the sanctuary, by flickering torch, amid stone echoes, they'd chant hymns, offer spelt, and strive not to doze standing, which was genuine concern. Inscriptions show haruspices disciplined for nodding mid-rite, usually with extra duties or chants. Dozed in dawn rite, now lead the next. Services could span hours, zealous orders extended to 3. Imagine maintaining devotion while your belly recalls dinner was spelt and a lesson, and your form fades. After, haruspices might return for second rest, or in strict temples proceed to study or labor, because nothing declares piety like etching mirrors on fragmented repose. Why so early? To dedicate night's purest part to gods, undisturbed by daylight's lures, mist, or cycles. It symbolized devotion, or at least once you overcame numb toes, smoke, and the off-key hymn from Brother Tages. In our time, resting solo is often luxury, signifying independence, peace, or blanket control. In ancient Etruria, solo slumber was dubious, impractical, or outright hazardous. Let's start with basics. Warmth. Homes, as noted, weren't toasty. Tufa walls and open vents trapped little heat, and sacred fire was centuries off, so people shared mats for essence heat, not closeness, but basic thermal need. Children with kin, parents, sometimes the visitor's child, if present. It resembled a gathering, but uninvited. But beyond warmth, there was mystical motive for group rest. Many believed night was when Aita stirred. Alone in dark, your anima might vulnerable to temptation or worse, unrest. Others nearby formed moral shield. If amiss, at least witnesses or first to thwart the entity. For young, solo night was inconceivable, not just comfort, but because spirits, deities, and wandering essences filled nocturnal tales. Stories warned against lone rest as portal to mischief and peril. And unlike modern tales, these ended in vanishings. Even couples often shared with offspring, servants, or guests. Privacy was myth. In fact, two alone on a vast mat would seem wasteful or profoundly suspect. In temple contexts, Haruspeces slumbered communally. Solo assignment was often penalty. Yes, sometimes lone mat was literal chastisement. Etruscan logic, solitary grants sin chance, group accountability. Next time you're alone in bed with your blanket in a room sans beast scent, savor quiet. In Etruscan lands, you'd likely have 2 kids, a sacred falcon, and a cousin, all crying. If you've napped upright in a meeting, cart, or waiting hall, you likely awoke with neckache and regret. But in ancient Etruria, upright rest wasn't mishap, it was choice. Some Etruscans, especially elite or devout, opted propped over flat. Why? Reasons, none restful. First, belief lying flat harmed digestion, breath, or life force balance. In a world where healers thought a cough could displace your anima, this seemed sound. Upright aided avoiding brain congestion, ominous but meaning don't choke on humors. Second, spiritual worries. Flat mimicked death pose. You avoided confusing gods or attracting Sharoon by resting funeral style. Superstitious? Utterly. But when your Haruspex was also healer, you chose battles wisely. Thus, people often rested reclined, bolstered by pillows, headrests, or carved supports like Etruscan easy chairs. Nobles had beds with angled props for semi-seated, ideal for processing evening wine or repelling surprise entities. Haruspeces advanced it. In strict orders, they might sit on benches or lean walls with naught but lituuses for comfort. It wasn't health, it was piety. Too comfy? Might dream. Dream? Might err. Err? Welcome to dawn confession. Needless, this wasn't quality rest. It was virtue, unease, and puzzling theology. Forget spectral visions or entities under mat. For Etruscans, true night terrors were already in fabrics, small, tenacious, and indifferent to chance. We're speaking, of course, about mosquitoes, lice, and the Etruscan bedroom's emblem, the hill flea. Let's not gloss. Hygiene wasn't Etruria's forte. Baths were ritual, laundry rare, and soap from ashes better unnamed. Add reed mats, shared woolens, and occasional holy bird, and you've got pest paradise. Fleas and lice were ubiquitous as roommates. Peasants battled daily. Nobles, despite frescoes and canopies, weren't immune. Some households had dedicated groomers, servants removing nits from their masters' togas and garb. Imagine that title, Keeper of the Royal Toga. Hill fleas were silent stalkers. They hid in bed frames, mat seams, even wall cracks, emerging nocturnal to feast like tiny demons. If wondered why Etruscans wore headrests and full attire abed, it wasn't always warmth, sometimes pest armor.
Remedies ranged effective to wild. Some burned herbs like myrtle or spelt to repel. Others slept with garlic, onions, or ashes abed, which might do little for pests but curbed intimacy. It wasn't mere itch. Pests symbolized impurity or divine disfavor, biting reminders of chaos and poor choices. Poems existed on mosquitoes, some moral, some oddly poetic, as nothing says devotion like "unite us as the flea that plagues us both." So while modern rest disrupts by alerts and lights, Etruscan was likely interrupted by scratching, twitching, and subtle shin crawl, because it was. We've had sleepless nights, but ever tried dozing in 50 pounds of wool? No? Well, in ancient Etruria, some did precisely that, because nothing says serene dreams like being ready for ritual at rest. Now clarify, most, even Haruspeces, didn't routinely sleep in full regalia. It was hot, heavy, and cumbersome, turning in layers like trying nap in a bramble bush. But during festivals or in sacred sites, sleeping partially adorned was safer, comfort optional, piety recommended. A night in temple might remove only headrest and jewels, keeping toga or tunic on, lest gods call midnight. Nothing like awaking to thunder hymns and needing attire while half dreaming of livers. In sacred precincts, attendants might sleep with staves or symbols aside, like fervent security talismans. Amulets doubled pillows, and if alarm sounded, at least no dressing. Priorities. Of course, full garb wasn't restorative. Wool isn't breathable, and beads pinch. Add stone floors, minimal padding, and ambient chants and torches, and you've got a rest environment ranking below Necropolis on comfort. Even non-ritual folks sometimes wore light protective items in uncertain areas. Traveling seers or warriors might doze in anointed cloths, offering slight safeguard and more padding than prayer alone. And garb wasn't subtle. Shift wrong, you might rustle so loud all awoke assuming the calamity arrived. In a time when nightly entities, pest swarms, and falcons abed weren't odd, you'd think somnambulism was mere quirk, but no, it was dramatic. In Etruria, if you wandered asleep, people didn't attribute it to fatigue or moon. They assumed possession, curse, or unfinished rite with the pantheon. Sleepwalking, or nocturnal wandering if impressing the scribe, was misunderstood and feared. Idea someone could rise from mat, shuffle room, stare at mirror was less harmless and more nether rehearsal. Accounts suggest genuine spook from sleepwalkers. Imagine, figure in toga, lamp in hand, eyes vacant, muttering runes unknown while stepping over beasts. You'd think apparition or heretic and both. And per local Haruspex, exorcism might schedule pre-dawn. Some believed caused by imbalanced life force, especially excess bile, Etruscan catch-all for inexplicables. Others thought anima temporarily freed, leaving body to amble like unattended hound. To prevent, they tried herbs to chants, hanging charms, or in rural tying leg to post. Extreme? Consider homes had open hearths, blades everywhere, and pots waiting overturn. In a curious note, rumors of tumulus climbing asleep. Whether exaggerated, fear of leaping dreamers led to latticed doors and debates if one could sin unconscious. Thankfully, most just paced, muttered, or tried imaginary gates. But if you sleepwalked to temple, locals might see divine sign or call cleansing to cover bases. If Etruscan life taught anything, it was resting through tumult. Temple lituuses, storms, bleating beasts, occasional raid. For the hill-shrouded weary, these were ambient, Etruscan white noise. Start with lituuses, temple signals marked sacred moments, dawn, rites, meals, and midnight vigils at 2 or 3 a.m. If near temple, dreams soundtracked by blasts. Brain adapted.
Liturgies became lullaby for overscheduled soul. Not just liturgies. Storms frequent, terrifying, no forecasts or sealed doors, every thunder like world end. Roofs leaked, lattices rattled, winds howled like wolves. Still, people rested. They must. Labor didn't pause for wakefulness, nor did farming, chanting, or evading Romans. Speaking which, invasions and cataclysms weren't always rest breakers. In eras, people slumbered through famine, war, even plagues. When chariots rolled morn, it was grim alarm over panic. And if not awake, some saw mercy. Inscriptions show resting through quakes, fires, and mobs. Deprivation common, bodies adjusted. If toil dawned to dusk, ate barely, spent days dodging vines, taxes, divine wrath, you'd crash hard. Then some used rest as escape, faced illness, loss, or world end, forecast often. Some curled under cloak, murmured right, napped. Strange wisdom there. In the shadows of 390 BCE, the city of Veii was wrapped in more than just mist. It was enveloped in defiance, routine, and a subtle unease that seeped into the walls and sacred fanes. The people of Veii were Etruscans, resilient, devout, and deeply tied to their volcanic soil. They believed they were thriving in a league watched by gods and favored by trade. Life was vibrant. The city had rebounded from earlier skirmishes. Markets thrived with bucaro, amber, and spelt. Warriors trained in the fields. Temples to Uni and Tinia stood proud. Add to this the humid Tuscan winter, and something was bound to erupt. That eruption came from Rome, long thought ambitious. Minor clashes had shaken the borders for years, but locals dismissed them as normal. Rivers froze, animals grew restless, but daily life continued. Artisans etched mirrors, merchants haggled, children played in courtyards. On a fateful day in 396 BCE, the siege roared to life, a massive Roman assault under Camillus. For the Etruscans, it was the beginning of the end. Battering rained down, blanketing walls and choking air. Some fled immediately, grabbing valuables and heading to the hills. Others sheltered in temples, hoping it would pass. By the sack, the city was buried under rubble. Conquest would soon seal their fate. Veii was a proud oppidum of thousands, a mix of Lucumones, Haruspeces, and artisans. What was about to happen would preserve their lore in Roman accounts, a snapshot of Etruscan splendor frozen forever. What began as rumbles in the tribes would soon become screams in the dark and a legacy of enigma that still captivates the world. Once the siege awoke, its fury spread like wildfire, silent at first, then devastating everything. The initial phase was encirclement, tight blockades for years. Gates groaned under pressure. People huddled in homes, covering mouths with cloths. They lit lamps against the unnatural despair, praying to city gods. The first victims were those on the ramparts, trampled in panic or slain by arrows, but soon the horror escalated. At the fall of Veii, the Roman breach hit, razing everything in days. Despair reached boiling point, bodies littered, spirits broke in the onslaught. And that's our journey through the cryptic world of the ancient Etruscans tonight. If this whispered tale of enigmas and forgotten history resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop your thoughts below. Until next time, may your nights be warded and your dreams prophetic. Good night.